It's now my honor and a privilege to introduce tonight's panelists. We decided to start our event tonight with some slightly extended introductions. You'll hear more about the details of the work each of them is doing as we proceed through the next hour. But to start out, as I introduce each panelist, I'm going to ask each of them to give us a very brief summary of the current work they're doing in response to the sexual abuse crisis, and to tell us about the moment when they knew that they had to take action in response to this issue. All right, so our panelists out there, you guys are ready, right? I am going to begin with Catherine Peed. Kathy Peed works with the organization Concerned Lay Catholics in the Diocese of Hamilton in Canada. So we'll begin with you, Kathy.
Thank you. Just want to clarify, although I personally am in the Diocese of Hamilton, Concerned Lay Catholics is a national organization, and we have subscribers and supporters across the country. So we are called Concerned Lay Catholics in Canada, and it started in the Diocese of Hamilton where I live, and it started in the summer of 2018, right after the Pennsylvania grand jury report was released. And a number of us came together to reflect and pray about what initially prompted us was the fact that nothing was being said in our churches. And we would go to Mass every Sunday and hear nothing from the pulpit. And everything we were learning from the secular media. So we began a process of educating ourselves and discerning where we needed to go with this. And so 3 years later, we have a website, we have a national organization, we are reaching out to victim survivors, we are hosting webinars, much as you are at Wake Milwaukee. So I think there's a lot of areas in which there's a lot of parallels, which tells me it's the Spirit at work when you see that kind of parallel happening. I'm going to be 65 in 2 weeks, so it's hard to sum up my life in 5 minutes, but I am a lifelong Catholic, and I have had a long and varied career that involved working both inside and outside the church. But whether inside or outside, I've brought my faith, my absolute certainty about gospel values into those settings. In terms of education, I began my graduate studies. I pursued graduate studies at Fordham University in religion and religious education. I worked in campus ministry, then I worked in high school chaplaincy. And beyond that, I've worked in government and I've worked in the community sector. So now that I am semi-retired, I feel I can bring the wealth of this diverse experience to the work which what we're doing at Concerned Lay Catholics. And it's important work, and I believe it's nothing less than participating in getting laity to participate in the church in a way that's essential, not only to the church's future, but to its survival. So that's me.
Kathy, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more about how all of us as laity, those of us here who are laity, can respond to the calls. We're going to next turn to Mike McDonald, who works as communications manager for Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, commonly referred to as SNAP. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, and it's such a pleasure to be able to be with all of you tonight. And I really was thrilled to be asked to be part of this panel. I'm the youngest of 8. Typical Irish Catholic family growing up, very devout Irish Catholic family. I was abused at the hands of 2 Catholic priests out of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia between the ages of 11 and 13. I initially found my anesthetic that was able to numb that pain for so many years up until the age of 35 when I first got sober. I found that anesthetic in the form of alcohol. And throughout those years, I had hidden so much of what went on, and I didn't want to let anybody in for fear of not only retaliation, but for fear of what would I be believed? What would others say about my family if I had said anything? And they were trusted figures that abused me. They were trusted figures within the community and certainly within the parish family. What has brought me to this point and this journey was the unveiling of my own personal truths and the unveiling and the ability to own my story, to take it back. And I really think deeply a lot about the question of what was that point that brings me to want to do something and to make change. And I think about the fight for my 11-year-old self. And I think about the 25 years of life that could have been totally different had the Archdiocese of Philadelphia decided to take care of the sheep instead of the abusive shepherds. With that, and within that journey, and that journey of recovery, certainly the journey of recovery in the disease of addiction meshes together a level of spirituality. And I was that young man who loved the liturgy, loved my Catholic faith, loved going to church with my parents, loved to sing, could sing Pange Lingua in Latin and in English at age 11. Not a bad singing voice, might I add. But I had discerned at one point in time a calling somewhere, maybe within the Catholic Church, and realized the moment that I was abused that I could no longer do that. But I took those steps and continued to young adulthood by attending church simply because of my mother. First woman I ever fell in love with. My mother's no longer with us, but I believe that today she would be proud of the work that I tried to contribute towards in unveiling the truths, seeking the truth and justice for survivors, helping to heal the wounded, but most of all, to protect our most vulnerable, children and adults who may be vulnerable. That's why I do what I do.
Mike, thank you so much for sharing your story. It is powerfully moving. I'm going to next move to Sheila Howe, who is a spiritual director and a licensed marriage and family therapist trained in trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive care. Sheila, tell us about your work and when you were moved to do this work.
First of all, I want to thank you so much, Awake organization, for inviting me. I'm really grateful, so grateful and so humbled to be here. This is just such an honor. And thank you, Mike and Kathy, for collaborating with me tonight in telling our stories. I've been a marriage and family therapist in the state of Arizona since 1983. I'm a trained spiritual director and have been a trained spiritual director for 23 years. I'm also EMDR certified, and I have a certification in integrative mental health care from U of A Dr. Weil's program. So my work has been very much integrative since the very beginning. In 1983, my master's was in movement therapy. So at that time, it was all theoretical. We did not have the neuroscience to say somatic embodied issues require somatic embodied therapies. So I began my process as a therapist in doing that. I ended up getting postgraduate training in marriage and family therapy, which helped me have a sense of systems. And I was able to, as a result, be able to differentiate healthy systems versus unhealthy systems. My first jobs were with Catholic institutions, 2 Catholic high schools and then Catholic social services. From there, I met this wonderful man named Father Doug. Father Doug started a huge parish in Gilbert, Arizona, back when Gilbert, Arizona was the fastest growing city in the United States. That was 1992. And it was at St. Anne's in Gilbert, Arizona, that I actually began to encounter individuals who were sexually abused within a religious setting. Father Doug was a married priest and he had 4 children, and his background was as a social worker. So he had this incredible pastoral, compassionate, loving persona that just drew people to him. And during that time, this is 92, 93, 94, we began to see the victims. We began to hear the stories of the survivors, and it was outrageous. I was a naive cradle Catholic. I had no idea this was going on, and it blew me away. So that was the moment. And in that moment, I made the decision to learn everything I can about the subject. I went to numerous conferences. I learned everything I could about sexual abuse. We didn't really have the language of trauma at that time. Judith Herman was really kind of the first one who began to talk about it in her book. It's developed so much more since the early 90s. But everything that was out there about clergy abuse, I learned. And that was when I became EMDR certified, as well as also became a spiritual director. So what was happening at St. Anne's was really quite remarkable because we had no plan. We had no template. There was nobody saying, this is what you need in order to help heal. But what we had was God just working us, creating that perfect storm of healing, kind of like how I'm sure Awake feels, the right people at the right time showed up. So there was Father Doug, who was doing the pastoral care. There's Sheila Howe doing the therapeutic care. We had Paul, who was the head of SNAP. I think he was probably one of the first SNAP coordinators, victims advocate. He was a parishioner of St. Anne's, which was wonderful. And we had this wonderful attorney who was Catholic and incredibly passionate about advocating legally for individuals who were sexually abused in religious institutions. So as you can imagine, what was also happening simultaneous was the hierarchy, the bishop's office, the diocese, they were closing all the windows and doors, right? There was huge resistance, huge threat, huge re-injury as a result of people coming forward and reporting. So eventually we became too much of a threat. 2005, my contract was not renewed. Counselors were no longer allowed to work out of churches, and Father Doug was moved to a much smaller church with an older population. So that was 2005. But here's the good news. Well, first of all, let me just say, Paul became the victim's advocate at the diocese. So he continued to work behind the scenes. He continued to refer people to us and to Father Doug. So people continued to get care that way. However, he eventually resigned and a new victim's advocate came, and she was no longer open to giving us referrals, which was fine because God was still sending people our way. And I have continued to see cases all along since that time, all the way up until just last year. So here we are, almost 30 years later, still seeing people, still seeing, the walking wounded, so to speak. People are still bleeding. What I'd like to do, though, is just kind of offer a little statement, and which would bring you to why I'm here today and what I'm doing here. Actually a program that I'm putting forth at this time. So as I reflected on all the clergy abuse cases I'd seen since 1992, I realized that God was in every single story. There was the story of trauma and soul wounding, but there also was the presence of God, presented as either a painful long lost call, a misplaced vocation, a broken love connection, or an intense seeking and longing for rediscovery. I was witness to memories of spiritual and mystical experiences that reside deep within their souls. I was introduced to many a higher power that rescued lives from self-destruction, alcoholism, and addiction. I also held space for complex, painful spiritual relationships filled with abandonment, betrayal, doubt, pain, fear, anger, and shame. So God was there all along in every single story. And Father Doug was the only priest I knew who could really hold space pastorally. And he passed away in 2019. So I have not known a priest personally. I'm sure they're out there and I want to meet them. But I personally have not known a priest who could do that pastoral work as he did. And so as a result, there's a gap. There's a gap around the spiritual care and well-being of individuals. So I'm affiliated with a group in Arizona, the Franciscan Renewal Center, where we have a website of people being referred as spiritual directors. And what I proposed to Kathy, the coordinator, I said, Kathy, let's make this spiritual direction program trauma-informed and sensitive, so that it's a safe environment for people to come and explore that relationship with God that is very much there. And so what I did is I created a training program that utilizes prayer, scripture, and neuroscience with the primary focus and reason is to be trauma informed and trauma sensitive for spiritual directors. So that's where I'm at today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila. I look forward to hearing more about that as the night goes on. We finally come to our own leader of Awake, for Sarah Larson, to tell everyone here her story about the work that she is currently doing with Awake and beyond, and how she came into that work.
Thanks, Mary, and thank you so much to my fellow panelists. It's a little humbling to go after Sheila, who has been doing this for so long, and I've just been in this little niche of ministry for just about 3 years, but I'm really grateful to be here. And like many of the other panelists here, I'm a cradle Catholic. I was raised in the church, and I loved the church throughout my childhood. I say that I fell in love with Jesus Christ when I was in high school in my best friend's Protestant youth group. And then I fell in love with the Catholic Church when I was in college studying theology at Marquette University. So after I graduated and I had a few babies, I ended up in parish ministry, and I worked in parish ministry for 8 years. Up until August of 2018, I was working there, and that was the month that the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out. And that was also the summer that we were learning about Theodore McCarrick and that whole scandal. And for me, all of that really hit like a punch in the gut. I was a Catholic that told myself this story about abuse in the church that I think is pretty common among many Catholics. And that's something like, a long time ago, a few bad priests abused some kids and it was terrible. But then when we found out about it, we fixed it. And now it's time to move on. And I think that's kind of the way I thought about this issue, at least unconsciously, until really just a few years ago. And then, the grand jury report, but even more than that, the McCarrick scandal really were so painful for me. And honestly, in a selfish way, I just felt really betrayed by the church that I loved, that I was giving my whole life to. And so I was really angry and I was really hurt and confused. And I spent a lot of the fall of 2018 kind of down this rabbit hole of internet research where I was just trying to learn and understand more. And I was reading survivor stories, and I was kind of coming to understand that the issues of mishandling and cover up of abuse were not over, that there were still problems today that we needed to deal with. I was fortunate at that time, the parishes that I work for were open to responding to all of this on a parish level. And so I was able to be part of listening sessions and some really good, honest conversations at the parish level about these things. But during that time, I started to just really feel called to address this in some broader way, more than I could do on the parish level. And so, not really knowing what I was getting myself into or really what I was going to do, I left my job in January of 2019. And the first thing I started doing was writing a blog that I was just using kind of to process my own thoughts and feelings and share what I was learning. And I started sharing it with some family and friends. And then it started reaching more people, including many of the people who are now on Awake's leadership team today. I was having a lot of dialogues with my fellow Catholics and just trying to figure out kind of what we could do as together as Catholics who cared about our church and wanted things to be different. And so we ended up gathering in my living room that spring. And over the course of several months of conversation, we ultimately discerned that we felt called to do something and that we felt called to do it together. And so that doing something together is what came to be Awake. So that was in August 2 years ago when we launched Awake. And that has been my life for the last few years, has been this work of raising awareness, of connecting with Catholics and helping Catholics engage with these issues, and more of walking with survivors and supporting survivors. And so that's now, I often say I came to this work from a kind of personal sense of betrayal and anger. And now my motivation has really shifted because I've been so honored to spend so much time with survivors, and really now many of my closest friends are people who have experienced abuse in the church. And so now my motivation is really coming from those people that I get to see and walk with and share life with. And I just want our church to do better for all of them and for all of the rest of us as well. So I know many of you know a lot about Awake already, so I won't tell you too much more about that, but I'm just really happy to be able to be part of it and to be part of a wonderful team here that all just works together to make all this happen.
Sarah, thank you. And to all of you, we really are so grateful that you said yes to our invitation to be here with us tonight. It's been a great experience planning this together. For those of us that have been involved in planning, it's been very interesting to hear about your distinctive journeys into and through this work. And then it's just inspiring to hear about how each of you has found a way to put your diverse gifts to service toward this common concern. It's evidence of different gifts, but the same spirit at work. So we hope that everyone here tonight receives not only good information, well, we know they will, from all of you about the work that you're doing, but also some inspiration and encouragement. So to guide their presentation of the information and the conversation between these four individuals, we have our own Erin O'Donnell, who has agreed to act as a moderator for this conversation. So at this time, I'm going to hand the mic over to her.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks. And thanks to the panelists for getting us started. So listening to the panelists, to your opening comments, I found myself wondering about anger and the role that it might have had in motivating you to take action. I think a lot of us tend to think of anger as a destructive force, a negative emotion that we have to overcome. But it also obviously can be a force for good. And so maybe, Kathy, we could start with you. Have you found anger to be helpful in this work?
When I think of anger, two words. I think of two words. One is information and one is energy. I just want to expand a bit on this. At a personal level, I will disclose that anger is probably one of the emotions that drives me in a lot of, in many things. So I have a kind of a visceral response to injustice that I've had since childhood, which manifests as a kind of an outrage, especially when people in a position of power or authority abuse their position. So that's kind of, when you say personally, how has that motivated me? Ask anybody, that's definitely a factor. And I work with it, I struggle with it, because it's not always productive or constructive. Mm-hmm. It's too reflexive. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, one of the people who, writers who have helped me in understanding the positive role that anger can play is Beverly Harrison, who wrote a book many years ago, The Power of Anger and the Work of Love. And it comes back to these two words that I associate with anger, which is information and energy. So anger, when it arises in the moment, is a warning. It alerts you that something is wrong in the relationships that you find critical. So it's a warning, it's information. It's a powerful source of information because it leads you to find out what needs to be mended. And it gives you the energy to take action. But once you identify what needs to be mended, at least for me, you need to let the anger go and you need to apply radical love, as Jesus did. Action must be taken when the anger reveals something that needs to be mended. But the action has to be taken in love and not in anger, or you just perpetuate the violence. That's not easy. It requires us to love our enemies and to do good to those who hate us. And that's the radical love that Jesus manifested. And that's what we're called to do, as hard as it is with our anger, is to apply it in love. At CLC, we chose as our scriptural inspiration a quote from Ephesians: "But speaking the truth in love, you must grow up in every way into Christ." Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about the anger of people and families who have been hurt by the church. That's not the anger I'm talking about. I'm talking about the anger in the context of the question you posed, which is, how can we use anger to advance the work?
Terrific. Thank you, Kathy. Mike, I wonder if you want to weigh in on that issue of anger and how you use it in this work.
Yeah, I immediately, when I saw the question and I thought about it, I think about the things that I've been taught in the recovery of my journey of recovery from addiction, and that's fear, anger, resentment, right? 3 number 1 killers of alcoholics and addicts: fear, anger, and resentment. So if I single out that anger, I have to take a look at my role in that. And am I going to let that anger define me? When I think of anger in this respect and how it could be a productive tool, certainly from a survivor advocate perspective, there's a basis for that anger. But that basis for the anger also has to have an answer. And that answer is a certain level of justice, a certain level of truth that has to follow that. But if I act out on that anger, the only person that I'm setting back is myself. If I do it in the spirit of goodness and the spirit of seeking truth and justice, the anger is a righteous anger. And it's a difficult one to talk about. I speak with so many survivors during the course of a week, and often I just have to listen, because each and every individual has their own process, and they have to process their anger in their own way. And they're allowed to. That's the most important thing. They're allowed to. What we try to do collectively is, again, utilize that anger, utilize the frustration that has been built up for decades, not only for survivors' sake and victims, and for families who have lost loved ones as a direct result of abuse that they had suffered, to utilize that now in a good way to see that this stops.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mike. Let's move on. I'd love to sort of dive into the work that each of the four of you do a little more deeply. And perhaps you could each, or someone could offer, what are the biggest challenges as lay leaders? What are the biggest challenges that you face in this work? Maybe Sheila, let's start with you. Oh, and I'm afraid you're muted. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. I think so. Just to kind of list, I think number one, it's easy to get discouraged. I shouldn't say it's easy, but discouragement is a part of it because there are so many limits and so many boundaries and so many roadblocks thrown up. It's such a reactive, charged issue that people can get discouraged. And as a result of the discouragement, they can get burned out. And with burnout comes negative thinking and low mood and low motivation, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that piece. The other piece is the vicarious traumatization that one can experience by listening to the stories. That's a challenge because it becomes important to be aware of that. It becomes important to recognize when it's happening to you. I mean, it certainly has happened to me, that vicarious traumatization where, you talk about the hyperreactivity or the hypervigilance or the anger gone awry kind of thing, hyperarousal, et cetera, that can affect one's body, one's mental health, one's spiritual health. So that vicarious traumatization piece is really important. So, just the need for a lot of care, a lot of self-care being very, very important. Also, the ability to be in some kind of supervision or some kind of community of gathering of people where you can debrief and process, and just kind of take care of yourself. That need for self-compassion. You talked about anger. Anger is a challenge. I mean, it's very easy to get really angry, right? That's a challenge. That's a byproduct of injustice, right? That's a byproduct of injustice that never gets restored. But with that, it does allow for us to move into solidarity with people who've been hurt and lean into compassion, not only for others, but for our own selves. So the need for the self-compassion and the other compassion is real key, I think. But yeah, I see that as the challenges. I lost a job. That was a challenge. And then the last piece was when I introduced the training that I was going to do to this group of spiritual directors, 2 people showed up. And when they introduced, one of them introduced the training to a group that included priests, the hypervigilance, deer with the headlights, right? Oh no, we can't do that. Fear. We're going to have lawsuits. We can't do that. So that's a challenge, is, being given this wonderful, prophetic, inspirational movement from God to move this along, and then to be met with fear and resistance and stonewalling can be very challenging.
Thank you, Sheila. I'd like to go to Sarah next. And Sarah, can you offer your thoughts on the biggest challenges that you face in this work?
Yeah, actually listening to Sheila, I was like nodding along like, yep, all of those things, the vicarious trauma, the discouragement. I think that one of the things I've come to realize the farther I get in this work is that really what we're talking about is changing a culture, is to changing the culture within the church. And that doesn't happen quickly. So knowing that there aren't going to be, instant results that fix everything, and maintaining hope in the midst of all that, I think can be really challenging. So there's that kind of interior struggling with that. I also think for me, one of the biggest challenges is feeling like I have to convince people to care about something that I think is so obvious that we should care about, but especially my fellow Catholics. It's honestly because I've been so ingrained in the Catholic Church for so long, it's really hard for me to see my fellow Catholics not responding better, and to try to encourage people to make this a priority, but to try to do that with love and patience, as opposed to with frustration and anger, which is sometimes how I feel when it seems like people don't care. So that is really challenging. And I think just very practically speaking, with Awake right now, it's kind of one of those the harvest is plenty, laborers are few kind of situations. I wish there were more of us to do all of this work. And sometimes it feels like such a big task. And for me, I would just love to have more laborers in the fields.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Kathy, I just saw you move there, and I just wondered if you wanted to add anything about the challenges that you face. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a little bit. I kind of a variation on what Sarah was saying about wishing that people would care more. I think really the big challenge, as I see it, is restoring trust. It's trust in all directions. How do you create and facilitate a process or some kind of movement and keep people at the table and allow them to expand the questions that need to be addressed in the face of people's trust having been broken? So the idea of vicarious trauma certainly was a motivation for us in having parish conversations, because we recognized that while people were reading about what their leaders had done in our name, or at least without our knowing, but we felt complicit, and so everybody feels betrayed. And so how do you even get them into the conversation, and how do you restore the trust? And I think working in small groups is so important, because when you bring people together and you start to open those conversations up, then, as Sheila says, then the Spirit starts working. And so if we try to overcome these challenges by ourselves, we're going to get frustrated and impatient. But when we really allow the Spirit of God to work in people coming together, that's where the trust gets built back up between people and among people, and that's where they feel the life.
Interesting. Now, I know that for many of us, maybe have come tonight hoping for a little extra bit of hope in this work, right? This is such a large systemic problem. It's daunting. So I really would love to hear about some of the successes that the four panelists have experienced in this work. Mike, can I check in with you? What do you see as sort of the little victories that you've had in this work?
Well, my answer may not be a liked answer. Okay. And just to kind of rewind back a little bit, we talk about trust and we talk about restoring the trust and faith. None of that happens unless we clear away the wreckage of the past. So with that said, those are the victory points. Those are the areas where organizations such as ours and other ally organizations, watchdog groups, whatever you wish to call them, by calling out the offenders, perpetrators who are named dioceses who are caught hiding information, because we know that that happens. The sad reality of it is that this is not a thing of the past. And that is the biggest challenge that we face when we talk to the everyday churchgoer. It's very much still a thing of the present. But the successes is that with survivors, each survivor shares his or her voice. For the first time, they get their power back. For the first time in their life, they get their power back. And from that power, it inspires others too to step forward. In complete awe of a recent case out of Indiana, youngest victims I've ever read about stepping forward. I shook like a leaf at age 35 in early sobriety to first share a little bit of my story. It took me still another 10 years to get completely authentic about it. So I believe that those are the victories by sharing the information, as horrific and as terrible it is. It's important work that we do by sharing it, by commenting on it, and allowing survivors to have their voice. Because if we really look at it, there's a grand jury report or an investigative report happening every day, whether it's singular or whether it's multiple individuals. And that's going to be the case, I think, for a little while, because there's so many secular investigations happening, but it's a purge. I always use this line, and I remember it. The resurrection doesn't happen without a Good Friday.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. And thank you for your for speaking the truth about this. Sarah, let's go to you in terms of sort of the what is working well, or what victories have you seen in this work?
Well, I mean, looking around at tonight's gathering, that's one of them, of course, is just bringing together people from all sorts of places and experiences, into dialogue about this. But I think for me, when I think about kind of the long, slow task of culture change and how painful that is and how discouraging that can be, in contrast, I've found that, the relationships and conversations I have with survivors are just the place where I can see like real good fruit happening like right now. And it's, Awake just started our survivor circles in September. And so we've only met with each of those groups twice. And I can already see just how powerful and it is for these people to come together in a safe space for honest conversation and supporting one another. And the ways that I can step out of the way and let them just support one another and listen to one another. It's so beautiful. And then the messages that come in after every one of those gatherings from people about how much it meant to them are just so encouraging. And the other thing I would say is, Awake has been given a lot of opportunities to support survivors directly in various ways. And just recently, as one little example, we were able to come together around a young woman who was abused by a priest just a few years ago in high school and was coming up on his criminal trial. And we were able to collect 30 something cards from people in the Awake community, who sent them all to my apartment. And then I gathered them all up and sent them along to her to open on the day before that trial. And she expressed how supported she felt and how she felt so much less alone walking into the courtroom with having had all that support around her. And similarly, it allowed us as a community to be church to her, to be what we are supposed to be among those people who have been harmed. And so that little action felt like, yeah, we're doing something right here, and we're doing something that's really making a difference to someone. We might not be fixing all the big problems yet, but we made a difference to one person. And that for me is what I always try to hold on to, is the opportunities to make a difference for just one person.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. There's something that multiple people have sort of acknowledged so far in the conversation, and I just would love to address it now. It's the work of getting fellow Catholics engaged on this topic. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts in terms of how we go about doing that. So maybe Sheila, let's start with you. Do you have thoughts on how to get fellow Catholics engaged?
I'd like to just add a little bit of the last question, because I just want to point out there's like almost parallel universes going on around this subject. You have, the underbelly, just the destructiveness and the violence of the abuse. But at the same time, there's incredible healing going on. Many dioceses have given money for therapy, for people to go to therapy. So when people get to therapy, they heal. I've seen, tremendous success stories. So I think engaging dioceses in that, they provide compensation, for counseling, that somehow people are able to get good trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive care from providers, because if they get that, they will heal. I have lots of confidence in that. I think there's engagement going on, Erin, in that I'm beginning to see this lovely kind of networking going on. Like how I came to know Sarah is amazing, right? Like I have a client who connected with Paula Camphor's small groups in the Diocese of St. Paul. And from there, I met Paula. And from there, I met Sarah. And then I discovered this was going on. And from there, I've met Mike and I've met Kathy and discovered what's going on with them. So I think engagement is happening, and I think that's very hopeful. Just recently I read, and I don't know if this answers the question, but I feel like the engagement is going to happen because God is ordaining it. There is a call. There are so many people. I listened to the wonderful talk with female survivors. I think it was the Berkeley. Fabulous. It was wonderful. And Jennifer Wortham, from Harvard, the other woman from Berkeley. Doing incredible work on moral injury, incredible research. So there's a lot of people being inspired all across the country. I think there's inspiration going on internationally. I read a wonderful quote about the French bishops, where there was an unveiling of a weeping child, a painting of a weeping child. And as a victim shared their story, the bishops all knelt in penance. Now, when the heck did that ever happen, right? That's engagement. Those stories of that kind of pastoral response to this issue will engage Catholics. To go back to Kathy's, I think the number one piece is safety. How do we make conversation safe? How do we get people to breathe? When our heart rate is variable, we listen. When our heart rate is beating really fast and our breathing is restricted, guess what? Nobody's listening and nobody's speaking. We're in defense mode, right? When we're in survival mode, nobody's listening. And what's being shared is not good. So I think engagement is going to happen with safety and breathing and heart rate variability.
Excellent.
Work on a body level first.
I love it. I love it. Kathy, what would you like to add about engagement of fellow Catholics?
Yeah, I think the safety is a key factor. And also, I'd like to just share a very brief testimonial from someone who attended our parish conversations, because I think she describes it kind of what I'm trying to share about engagement. But she said, so we organized parish listening sessions, and we did a combination of letting people talk about their experience of the crisis, but we also shared with them information, just as Sheila was talking about what the church is doing. It's a little bit different in the Canadian church, not a lot. I mean, our bishops aren't, saints by any means, but still there are places where good things where some good things are starting to happen. Not enough, but it's moving in a direction. So this person said, the shared stories of other parishioners, their experiences, feelings, and hurts helped me realize that I was not alone in my sense of betrayal and desire for change. But more than that, I experienced what church is all about. Shared accountability, support, listening, engaging, learning, attending to each other's pain and hurt, and allowing healing to begin. Our thoughts and feelings were validated, our ideas and suggestions for change were taken seriously, and I left with a deeper sense of community and renewed hope for healing and renewal of the church. And we did that by the combination of creating safe space, having counselors available. We told people 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 5 or 6 boys. So people in this room, even though you may not know, are already suffering from this. So we had provisions for that, but we also gave people information. Lay people are tired of not knowing what the church is doing. And so we really need to, and that's why Concerned Lay Catholics has created this resource to put information, good and bad, in the hands of ordinary Catholics. And that's how you engage them, by treating them like adults in the church, giving them information and telling them they have a role in co-responsibility with the clergy.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And just a pause here for a moment. I'd like to invite our listeners and our audience here tonight, if you have questions that are cropping up for you as a result of what our panel has said, please go ahead and shoot those questions to Catherine in the chat so that she can direct those to get those ready for the Q&A portion. So thank you for that. But Kathy, thank you for raising the idea of co-responsibility. I think Mike, I'm really interested to hear from you, because I know that your work with SNAP, you probably encounter, I'm just curious to know how it works, that process of engaging Catholics, what your experience has been.
I couldn't wait for you to call on me.
Yeah.
But so it is difficult. And I want to just to kind of lay a little concrete of what we deal with on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and really what survivors need. There are so many practicing Catholics that know of survivors, but how many survivors are you going to see in the pews? You're not. That's the reality of it, right? So how can you support the survivors and help them through their challenges? One of the biggest ways that we see for the community, the parish community, and the community as a whole, to be able to support victims is, number one, to believe them. If we really think about it, who wants to talk about a sexual experience they had with a Catholic priest, nun, religious, or Catholic lay teacher? But also many states, as we see the statute of limitations reform happening, and there are many states that have proposed legislation. Not to our surprise, a few years ago here in Pennsylvania, from the pulpit, parishioners were given pieces of literature to encourage their state legislators to vote against opening window legislation. So I really would encourage parishioners in the community to educate themselves as to the why behind all of this, because the immediate why is not about money. It's not about compensation. It's about validation, but more importantly, exposing predators that still may be very well active in their community. And through that type of legislation, it gives the victims, the survivors, the opportunity to name those abusers. And then it also uncovers discovery, further evidence, just as we've seen so much in states, Ohio and Michigan, terrific secular investigations that are uncovering, evidence. But I think that most important part is to support, to believe them, and to open their heart, because there's a lot of pain-filled survivors that just need someone to listen to them, to believe them, and reach out that hand. And if they want a hug, give them a hug, because that's what Christ would do.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks. And I also just, Mike, you just mentioned the importance of education. And I want to put out a plug here for the Awake blog, which comes out every week with new content, because that's one of our big goals for the blog, is to share information. So please take a peek at that when you have a moment. Let's see here. I think taking a look at the time, I think that I'm going to ask one more question. And then we will go on to the audience questions. There's something that I'm really intrigued by, and that is how this work, I'm thinking of you four panelists, how this work has affected your faith lives. So maybe, Sarah, let's start with you on that question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I guess the honest answer is this has been really hard. It's been really hard for me. And, I'm speaking with people who've been thinking about this for a lot longer than me, but I spend so much time in all the darkest parts of the church and learning a lot about awful spiritual abuse that often goes along with the sexual abuse. And so all of those words and images that I hear from survivors are in my head all the time. And that's a difficult thing. And I think as someone who has always felt very at home in the church, I've come to kind of realize over especially the last year that, I'm still a committed Catholic. I still love my church, but I'm not sure I will ever feel at home in the same way that I did before all of this. And so that's hard for me. I will say, though, that I have come to this understanding that, getting close to the darkness and the suffering and, the wounds that's getting close to Jesus. And so that's what this is supposed to be all about. And so I'm trying to just kind of take solace in the fact that when you're standing with people who have been harmed and people who have been oppressed, that you're standing with Jesus. And so I've had to ask myself a lot of hard questions about, is my faith in church leaders and church institutions, or is my faith in Jesus Christ? And so that's kind of where I come down at the end of just trying to stay close to Jesus and kind of allowing all the storms around me to just keep on blowing and just trying to stay centered on that in the midst of all of it.
Thanks for sharing that, Sarah. Let's see here. Sheila, would you like to take that one as well? I'm curious to hear what you think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because gosh, this journey's been such a long journey for me, and it's been a wonderful journey. It's been a painful journey. It's been a tough journey, but it's been a real refining journey. I mean, the really great news about our Catholic faith is we have a 2,000-year history of mystical spirituality. We have great models that can help us navigate our way through this issue. You know, I think of Mary. She was a mother who raised her son in the Jewish faith. It was the Jewish faith leaders that handed him over to his death. She was betrayed by her religious leaders. The apostles, they were betrayed. They were vicariously, secondarily, and communally traumatized, as well as directly. Jesus was traumatized, right? He was a victim. So how did they go on then to do this 2,000-year mission? How did they go on to do that? And so if you sit with scripture and use it as a good old lectio divina to help you understand, and that's what I do a lot of, I see what they did. They gathered together. Jesus showed up numerous times. They had incredible encounters with Jesus before Pentecost. There was a lot of fear. There was a tremendous amount of fear. They didn't want to believe. They gathered in the upper room and they were scared to death, but they gathered together. And I imagine in that gathering that there was great conversation and great debriefing and great processing about how hurt they must have been and how traumatized they were by their faith leaders and how they couldn't believe it. And they probably shared incredible pain. But then the Holy Spirit showed up, right? And they were transformed and they were refined. And whatever happened in that upper room with that process, they went on to do incredible and impossible work. And so that's what I look at in regards to this issue is Mary, Jesus, the apostles, the nucleus of our faith, the core group who started this faith went through the same exact thing, but they figured it out. And so that's what gives me hope. So, you know, I'm like Sarah in that, you know, I had an Irish grandma. I'm Irish Catholic too, Mike. It's in our culture too. It's a 2,000-year-old culture. It's like in our soul, our collective unconscious, right? So my Irish grandma would say, if an ignorant priest gets in your way, you just go around them to Jesus. And so that's, you know, I think part of mature spirituality too is that we begin to differentiate our spirituality from the human church, right? And we dive into a deeper, more interior space where we have that intimate relationship with Jesus. And we tend to be more inclined to do that work when we suffer. So the suffering then is the template for a deeper awareness of who God truly is. So that's, but like I said, it's been a very long journey. With lots of spiritual counsel and support in that. So,
right. Clearly, community is really an important piece to that process. And Mike, I'd really like to hear from you as well. You know, what has this journey, how's it shaped your faith life?
Difficult to answer. I again, I reflect back on the process of recovery from the disease of addiction, certainly reintroduced a level of spirituality within me because the underlying condition was that spiritual malady that I had. And I remember my sponsor started to talk to me a little bit more about God and the higher power thing. And I got all that. I mean, I was, you know, that was ingrained in me. But I told him that I didn't think God was going to be able to help me. And he asked me this question, and it stuck with me ever since. He said, when you get on an airplane, do you ask the pilot for his or her credentials before they fly you? I said, no. And he said, then why are you asking God? So I have to keep it on a level that it doesn't mean that I have to follow each and every directive in the Catholic faith. It doesn't mean that I have to attend Mass on Sunday, because I don't. And I want individuals to understand why. Because the smell of a burnt candle is a trigger for me. I was molested in a sacristy after Mass, before Mass. I was molested during Mass. Wash away my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin. When the priest would reach down for the towel below the visibility of the altar, he molested through the cassock. I cannot attend and walk through the church doors because the devil walked through those church doors, but it doesn't take my church away from my heart. That foundation of faith is still there for me. And I have to be careful in many ways and in many conversations with survivors that I speak with, because just like in any 12-step group, I could easily alienate and easily push them into a darker place. That's their process. For my process, yes, I still hold on to my father's rosaries. It's missing a ton of beads, which helps me end a lot sooner. But it's meaningful for me. And I think about the deep faith that my parents had. And in my heart, I always think of one of the saints that I'm most fond of. And I think Gus was onto something here. Saint Augustine said, my heart is restless until it rests in you. So if that means continuing doing the work that I'm doing by exposing the darkness so that there might be light and light for individuals, exposing the hidden secrets and those who have enabled these predators to go on. And it's been going on for many, many, many years, possibly 1,000. I'm going to continue to do what I do, and I'll do it in mind that I am, and in a every day, I ask God to guide me as to what he would have me do. And that brings me to tonight as well.
Excellent. We're glad you're here. I think that might be a good moment to just take a pause so that we can switch over to audience questions. And so I'm going to pass the microphone to Marcus Mesher, who is another member of our Courageous Conversations team. So thank you, Marcus, for sharing what we have from the audience.
Thanks, Erin. And my sincere thanks to Mike and Sheila and Kathy and Sarah for all that you've shared and the encouragement that you're offering us to keep hanging in there. So we do have a couple questions from some members of the audience, and I just want to remind everyone that if we haven't asked your question, it's not because we didn't think it was valuable. We are running a little bit short on time, and we also want to make sure that the questions that we raise are always sensitive to survivors, and we hope, of course, that we can continue the conversation next week for part 2. That said, we do have quite a few questions that we'd still like to hear our panelists respond to. And I think, maybe we could start with just by asking you to share a little bit about, in terms of, what you're working toward at this moment, and how do you measure your success? What does that look like for you? Or how do you know that that your level of investment is worth all the time and energy that you are investing? So yeah, Sarah, do we want to start with
sure,
you? And then if we can hear from
jump
all
in.
4 of you, that would be great.
That's a really good question. I would say, one, I really try not to measure whether the amount of work we're putting in is worth it or paying off, because I think that's just a recipe for discouragement. But I would say that I really try to think about success again as just one person at a time, because I kind of want to change the world, but that is a slow and process. And so for me, it's just that kind of thinking about small victories, one person at a time, and also just recognizing that the work is bigger than any one person or any one organization. And so when I hear about what other people are doing, I want to take that as measures of success as well, because we're all in this together.
Thanks, Sarah.
If
Sheila?
I may, you know, I take a look at the benchmarks of success, and I'm what comes to mind is the 2002 Dallas Charter as sort of a scorecard in the work we do. Is there a safe environment in dioceses throughout the U.S.? You know, I believe that some are doing a heck of a better job than others. Certainly in California, they have probably a gold standard. Healing and reconciliation, I don't know. You know, it seems as though that, again, when it comes down to the healing part, I don't know how much dioceses are actually doing for survivors. I know that there are many dioceses that are, but the reconciliation part, what defines reconciliation? For a survivor, let a survivor tell the diocese what reconciliation really means. Prompt and effectiveness towards allegations, I give it an F right now with dioceses across the U.S. And there are many bishops. Archbishop of Philadelphia, I had a personal conversation with, absolutely will say that same thing, that he believes that the church has failed tremendously when it comes to this. Cooperation with civil authorities. Secular investigations are telling us, we've seen it in the news, that certain dioceses have failed to cooperate with secular investigations. That tells us it's a direct violation of the 2002 Dallas Charter. We talk about discipline to offenders. It was only recently that Vatican changed canon law, an archaic law, 18 years since it last changed, to now label abuse, right? They had to define what child abuse was. It's archaic in 2021 that we had to do that. But the means of accountability for the future. And so taking a look at each one of those categories and holding their feet to the fire. Again, I go back, clear away the wreckage of the past. If you do that, and you're transparent in everything that you do going forward, you have a chance of moving forward and in a healthy way, regaining that trust, helping survivors.
Thanks, Mike. Sheila, how about you?
Yeah. So the training program I put together came from this latest case I've been working with. This individual was horribly traumatized as a 10-year-old child. I'm trying not to give too many identifying characteristics away, but anyways, the individual lost a son a couple years ago, and from that the trauma was recalled, and she had just gave it away. She had really bad PTSD symptoms and suicidal ideation. She went to 9 different priests, very strong Catholic, 9 different priests, and ended up being re-traumatized each time. And the trauma and the effects of that, the re-traumatization, actually took on a larger life than the initial trauma as a 10-year-old. And by the time she came to seek me out, she's full-blown PTSD, dissociative symptoms and horribly depressed. She's doing really well now, though. Thanks be to God, right? She got therapy, and she's yet to get the kind of pastoral support, but she was able to connect with a couple of these groups that are out there, and that's been great. So what do I want to see? I want to see a traumatized church heal, so that the individuals who are traumatized as a result of sexual abuse in a religious organization can actually get the care and the compassion that they deserve. I would love to see the church as an organizations, and the organizations within the organizations become trauma informed and trauma sensitive. We have the neuroscience and we have the organizational understanding now to know how to do that. So if that can happen, we have the charter, right? 2002, but we still do not have trauma information and trauma sensitivity. And if that can happen, and people can just start to name trauma, okay, there it is, and know how to respond to it with safety, collaboration, empowerment, mutuality, then it's very possible that individuals like the person I work with could actually find care and compassion within the context of our church. Now that would be the ultimate in healing. That's what I aim for. That's big though. Big, big,
Yeah.
big.
Thanks, Sheila. Kathy, how about you?
For me, success is everybody doing what's been given them to do. And what I've heard tonight is Mike working for justice and accountability, and with survivors to make sure that they receive justice as far as you can, and to hold perpetrators accountable. And that's an important piece of our success. I hear Sheila talking about therapy and about creating a trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive approach to ministry. And all of us saying that we've done a really bad job as a church of the healing and the reconciliation. We're doing a not bad job on a forward-looking project of safeguarding, and every diocese in Canada has safeguarding panels and a bishop's delegate, and we have policies and procedures and training, but we're not really dealing yet well with the wounded among us who are just hanging out there and don't really know where to go with their pain. So part of what we're trying to do at Concerned Lay Catholics is create space for those folks and for ordinary Catholics who really do care, and there are lots of them, to come together. And we don't need a priest or a bishop to give us permission to do that. We need to let people know that we believe them, that we care about them, and that to the extent that they wish to have a relationship with us as fellow Catholics, we want to have that too. And that for me is the success, that we're all doing a piece of this, and Awake is doing their piece with survivors. And I think that we're doing this without the hierarchy. If they want to come along, we're happy, but if they don't, we're going without them.
Yeah, Kathy, that's a great point. And that actually relates to the last question I wanted to pose. I don't know if we quite have time, but we really are inspired by the leadership that you are providing us, and trying to live up to this vision of being co-workers in the vineyard. And I maybe, just as a real short final word, trying to keep it to a minute or less, what is it going to take to have robust collaboration between the laity and our clergy as you see it?
Courage. It's going to take courage. Yes, there's still trusting figures, and we look up to individuals, but have the courage to confront that elephant in the pew. Have the courage to say, Father, why don't you talk about your feelings about your brother priest, your brother religious and how it has affected your vocation. Tell us that instead of giving us the homily that is from the scripture for that day. Let's speak the truth. So for the laity and for parishioners alike, have the courage to step forward. Again, I loved removing the hierarchy out of that piece, because again, it's the church is not individuals. It is a huge thing.
Thanks, Mike.
Can I
Sheila?
share? I just want to piggyback on Mike. Mike, exactly. I take a page out of the peacemaking people, the peace and justice people, and what they really advocate for is self-reflection. So I think the question, and you kind of posed it, Mike, is how has this issue in the church impacted me? How has it impacted my thinking? How has it impacted my emotions? Where do I carry that in my body? And how has that impacted my behavior and my spirituality, starting with self? So I think that self-reflection piece is really key. And I think from there, then there can be, some real true and honest sharing. But it requires a vulnerability, which is courageous. So
I'm fine with leaving it with those two answers, since I know we're short on time.
Okay, well then in that case, I'll turn things over to Mary so she can bring us home.
Thank you all. Well, since our intention with this series is for the conversation to lead us toward action, as we end this evening's conversation, I want to invite everyone to take specific action steps in response to what we've heard tonight. And after I present these action steps, I have a couple of very brief announcements. So the first action step is to invite you to part 2 next Tuesday, November 18th. We look forward to engaging with you in dialogue about the issues and ideas that tonight's panelists have presented and that they have discussed with each other. Through that process, we can surely help one another not only further think about these ideas, but also discern some next steps in our own particular contexts. To give you a sense of what to expect, we'll gather again at 7 o'clock on Zoom as a large group, and we'll take a look at small ways that lay people can make a real difference in our church's response to this issue. And then we'll break into small groups for discussion. We'll end back in large group again, sharing some key reflections and ideas. The opportunity to register for part 2 will be part of a follow-up survey that you'll receive. So please watch for that email and take a moment to fill it out as soon as possible so that we know who will be joining us next week. And then for everyone, we want to offer some ideas for ongoing action steps, particularly if you already know that you can't join us next week. As our panelists have clearly witnessed tonight, each of us is called to respond to this issue and really all the concerns of our world in distinctive ways based on our disposition, our background, our gifts, and our resources. And we'd like to encourage everyone to choose and commit to one of the following simple actions. So if you're a heart-centered, introverted, spiritual person, commit to a few minutes of daily prayer for victims of abuse by the church every day for the next 30 days, maybe setting a reminder on your phone. And as a special part of tonight's event, Sheila has prepared a prayer for all of us in the Lectio Divina style that we'll be sending out in that follow-up email. So you have that to look forward to as well. Now, if you're a head-centered introvert, commit to reading an article, an essay, or a blog post about the abuse crisis on a regular basis. Maybe set a goal stretching yourself to do this more than you currently are. As Erin, our blog editor, mentioned earlier, we publish a post every week. If you're more of an extrovert or you just want to challenge yourself, commit to sharing one new learning or story or idea that you've heard or learned from your engagement with this issue with a friend, family member, or even coworker, maybe over your regular coffee break lunch, book club, or other social engagement. If you're a more action-oriented person, call your parish, ask them, what are they doing to actively support victims and survivors of abuse, and maybe even offer some suggestions. Awake always especially encourages everyone, make space and time to listen to what survivors say, what they want us to know. A particular suggestion from Kathy Peed tonight is to make it your care to learn about trauma, especially in the context of clergy sexual abuse, how it's experienced, how it manifests, and its long-term effects. She suggests we do this not in isolation, but with other concerned lay Catholics, and reminds us we don't need our pastor or our bishop's permission to learn about the issue, and that ordinary Catholics sometimes fail to appreciate the extent to which victims are re-traumatized by our lack of understanding and even judgment. Finally, consider whether you can donate to or volunteer time with Awake or another organization offering support to victims and survivors. Now, for those of you attending tonight because you've experienced abuse in the Catholic Church, we're grateful you chose to join us. If you're looking for resources for ongoing support, we invite you to visit Awake's website and select the For Survivors tab. Awake Survivor Circles will be open to new participants again in January. So if you're interested in connecting with fellow survivors for community and support, please check out the information on the website. Okay, now just a couple of closing announcements before we sign off. And of course, one more time, thank you again to everyone for being here. Please watch for that follow-up email, including a feedback survey with a registration form for next week's dialogue opportunity and some other information. And then we're excited to announce our next Courageous Conversation that's going to take place on January 13th. It's going to mark the 20th anniversary of the Spotlight Team's 2002 investigation of clergy abuse in Boston, Massachusetts. It's going to feature a panel of journalists, including Walter Robinson, who led the Spotlight Team, Jason Berry, a pioneer in uncovering abuse in the 80s, as well as Anne Barrett Doyle, co-founder and co-director of Bishop Accountability. So watch our social media and your emails from Awake for more details soon. All right, we are going to end tonight with prayer for those of you who would like to join us. Okay. So our closing prayer tonight is, God of peace and mercy, be near to comfort, guide, and protect all of us, but especially the wounded who are dear to you. In the midst of our concerns, anxieties, frustrations, sadness, anger, and uncertainties, may your Holy Spirit provide us with the strength and gifts needed to see and tend to the wounds, to bring forth the beloved community of belonging you call us toward. Thank you again for joining us. Good night, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you all. Good night.